A man I'm sure will have a view on all things to do with China is Sir Iain Duncan Smith. Sir Iain, very good morning to you.
Good morning. Good morning, Mike.
Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Let's kick off with China. Rachel Reeves has just come back from China, having got what might be described as a pretty paltry deal, £600 million worth of investment, which is approximately 60 times less than Indonesia got, 30 times less than Peru got. What do you make of the government's approach to China at the moment?
Well, it's a mess. The government has got this absurd idea that if they rush to China on their bended knees, China somehow is going to give them the thing they need for growth, which has collapsed as a result of their budget, which has smashed into small businesses, particularly in farmers. So going to China is a terrible decision. China is guilty of genocide in Xinjiang amongst the Uyghur, which is the eradication of a whole ethnic group. Most of the men are now in slave labor. They work on products like, for example, the solar arrays that we import now as a result of the government's policy on net zero, which is mad. We're importing thousands of these things, but they're made in China, and polysilicon is part of them, and that is made basically in Xinjiang by slave labor. It goes on, you know, the Shane, this company that the government wants to register here in the London Stock Exchange, they are suspected of using slave-made cotton in their products, which they refuse to answer questions over. I mean, it goes on and on. They're threatening Taiwan. They're threatening a blockade. They're threatening to basically invade. They're building a navy at a rate of knots you simply can't believe. This is a threatening country, and the government is behaved astonishingly in turning over what was going on before and now acting as though they're a great ally and friend, which is an utter disaster. It'd be like we were doing in the 1930s, ignoring the threat of Hitler, only to find that everything he said he would do, he does, which is exactly what President Xi has done.
Well, quite. And, of course, it looks as though the Chagos Islands deal is somehow tinged by China as well, because a lot of people think that, you know, that has China's sort of fingerprints all over it. You know, at the beginning, when the conversations were being had between David Lammy and our government and Mauritius, there was a different government there, and they tried to sort of rush it through before that election. Then, now there's a new government. They've sort of seemingly tried to sort of bribe them with payment promises of £9 billion in order to sort of give it away. I mean, I've never heard of a deal where you give something to somebody, but then you also pay them in addition.
Yeah, there is no need to do a Chagos deal, first and foremost, because the ruling at the UN doesn't have direct effect on the British government. So, in other words, it was what's called an advisory ruling. Yes. But it honestly, there are really serious issues here. The Chagosians, who I think it was a mistake to move them out in the 1960s, we should let them go back to their home. They don't want to be run by Mauritius. All they want to do is remain as British citizens. They just want their homes back, which I think is quite reasonable, and we could do that. We don't need to do the deal. Mauritius was never really part of Chagos Islands. It actually was only used as an administrative centre by the British many, many years ago for ease and for help for the British, not for Chagos. And so the result is that this deal is a disaster. We're going to pay for what we already have, huge sums of taxpayers' money. This is a strategic centre, vital area in our position. It covers all the trade routes going east and west. China's had its eyes on that area completely. And the Americans, I know, talking to many of those who are involved with the Trump arrangements and also Republicans, are deeply disquieted by what the British government is doing without any real reason for doing it in the first place. And we should stop this at once. And Trump, I think, will be saying to them, this is a bad deal and it risks our security, and we shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, exactly right. And I mean, the Keir Starmer government isn't known so far for kind of going back on anything or having second thoughts, and they keep pressing ahead with their ideas, no matter how unpopular they seem to be. But they don't seem to quite know what to do on this Chagos Islands deal.
No, well, they were rushing. The worst bit about it was they brought in Mr. Powell, who used to advise Tony Blair, and he and the others were rushing to the Mauritius to try and get a deal out of the new government in a hurry to miss President Trump's inauguration. That has stalled completely. I heard the latest thing was that the Mauritian government were asking only for 50 years, not a 90-year lease. So this whole thing is falling apart, and they won't disclose the amount of money that they would have to pay to Mauritius. They won't tell Parliament that. They won't tell anybody. So we've been complaining very loudly that they should not be rushing this deal before a new president is inaugurated on the 20th, because US has real skin in the game on this. It's their base that's there. They lease it from the UK government, and they should be able to say whether or not they want this deal to go ahead. And I understand lots and lots of Republican politicians in America do not think this deal should go ahead. They don't want China's interference, which of course is exactly what China wants to do, which is to try and get a land grab here and to put themselves in this area to mess around with the US and the UK and the free world's ability to be able to control and protect the trade routes.
It does seem extraordinary, doesn't it? And just going back to China for a moment, I mean, what is it that China, do you think, has in mind with this £600 million deal that they gave to Rachel Reeves? Also, the deal that they want to get involved with for wind turbines and for solar panels and all those things that you mentioned. You know, Ed Miliband, it seems, doesn't care about national security, he just cares about net zero.
Yeah, I think this is the most ill-informed and poor Secretary of State for the Environment as possible to imagine having put in post. The reality is that China went from nowhere in the production of solar arrays and all the other net zero stuff, went from absolutely nowhere in the last 10 years to dominant in the world. How do they do that? They do it because, against WTO rules, the Chinese central bank subsidizes all bids of Chinese companies, I gather to almost 100% of bid value, which undercuts everybody in the free market. The second bit of it is they use slave labor. And slave labor means you don't pay anybody any money. They have to do this under threat of bullying, violence and death. And this is going on all the time. As I said earlier on, polysilicon, which is made in Xinjiang, is made by slave labor. This has been completely ignored by the British government, who say that they would stand up against slave labor. And I asked them a question of that yesterday. And the reality is they're already importing thousands of these arrays, which they want to litter across the countryside in this mad rush to net zero, no matter what the cost to consumers. But they're doing this using products made by slave labor, and they don't just use it there. Cotton made in Xinjiang, which is 40% of, well, cotton, is also made using slave labor. China doesn't care a damn about net zero because they're building coal-fired power stations at a rate of knots in China. So all this stuff is made using dirty, dirty fuels. So it's ironic that Miliband and co. want to get cozy with China when China is basically sticking two fingers up in the air to all the ambitions over net zero. You couldn't make this up if you tried.
You really couldn't. And more noise is being made as well from inside of government that, you know, they want to reach out to China because it's a very important part of the global economy, and they must make sure that they can sort of somehow, you know, take account of the fact that Trump's new government might put tariffs on Britain and they might need to move away from America. I mean, it's almost hard to believe that that's their thought process, but it seems to be.
Yeah, this is a government that likes to jump into swimming pools when the water's running out.
Yeah.
So let's just look at this. The European Union is now talking about tariffs on electric cars. China made a decision to tell all of their battery companies, by the way, they've dominated battery production for years. Every battery used in cars in the UK in electric vehicles are made in China, and we'll never be able to compete with on that again because of the points I made earlier on. A lot of the minerals that are used in this are mined and used, made by slave labor. But the whole idea about what we're doing is when Europe is now talking about tariffs against dumping of those electric cars in Europe, America is going to tariff China on the basis of dumping of their electric vehicles. We are the one country that goes, oh, let's go to China and say how much we love China and that we're going to do business with people that are appalling. I mean, this is a brutal government. It executes more people than any other country on the planet. It practices organ harvesting from those prisoners and others. And you have to take the organs out when people are still alive. They export those to countries like the UK. I mean, this government is every bit as brutal and ghastly as Nazi Germany was back in the 1930s. But this government seems to think it wants to go and cozy up to them, which I find utterly astonishing for all those poor people that are being decimated by the Chinese government.
Absolutely right. Can I just ask you one final question about the story on the front page of the Telegraph today, Sir Iain? Prime Minister to pay damages to Gerry Adams. An awful lot of disquiet about this, particularly amongst the families of victims of the IRA. But it's apparently some kind of absolution, if you like, for Britain, because we've got this absolute commitment, according to Hilary Benn, Northern Ireland Secretary, to the Human Rights Act. It seems a very bizarre move, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's wrong. The government's wrong to do this. The last government had to come up with some legislation that eventually protected those who were there to settle the peace. So many soldiers, I must tell you, I served in Northern Ireland, and I lost a particularly good friend who was murdered, tortured, it appears. Bodies never been disclosed or found. There are a lot of British soldiers that face serious and difficult decisions over there, and this was all down to the terrorism. So what we're now heading for is a government that seems to think that those who were part of that process, that were part of the process that was bringing British soldiers in to protect the innocent civilians, will now find that law is made on their behalf rather than to balance this so that we can end this perpetual pursuit of soldiers and others and policemen in Northern Ireland that were trying to do their duty. I just find the only way to settle this was the way that it was being done before. And this other issue about almost every single legal brain, every single government advisor and official that has been in government has advised the government that this original judgment by the Supreme Court was wrong, and that the appeal that's going on now should have been proceeded with because this needs to be stopped. Ministers should have the right, and was always believed had the right, to make these decisions, and the appeal court has turned that over. And I think everyone thinks, everybody in the legal profession that's got half a brain thinks that this actually was a wrong decision. And so the government is now acting in a peculiar, not just pro-human rights at all, actually, but what about the human rights of those who were there, sent there to protect the civilians? That seems to have been dismissed and chucked overboard.
Absolutely right. Sir Iain, very good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Sir Iain Duncan Smith, MP, former Conservative Party leader there, formerly served in Northern Ireland, of course, as well. Families of the victims of Northern Ireland horrors and bombings from the IRA are absolutely disgracefully disappointed by this. Suzanne Dodd, whose police officer father Stephen was killed in the Harrods bombing in 1983, said, considering the IRA victims have not received any compensation, how could Gerry Adams get compensation? My father was killed 41 years ago, and it's highly unacceptable to hear that. Absolutely right. I mean, is there anything this government can get right? There doesn't seem to be.